It's strange how a single moment can quietly loosen the threads of your entire life. How something as small as a look, a sigh, or a forgotten sentence can echo louder than any shouted truth. And that's exactly what Mira kept thinking the night everything began to tilt. The night when the house felt heavier than usual. As if the walls themselves were waiting for a confession neither she nor Rowan was ready to make. She had always believed that marriage wasn't supposed to shatter in one dramatic blow, but rather wear down slowly. Like a rope fraying strand by silent strand. And she felt that fraying now more than ever as she stood in the dim kitchen with only the hum of the refrigerator for company, turning Rowan's words over in her mind. Wondering when the distance between them had grown so wide that even their memories no longer touched. Rowan wasn't a cruel man, if anything. His flaw was the opposite. A kindness so quiet it sometimes felt like absence. And Mira had spent years convincing herself that this gentleness was enough. That stability was its own form of passion. But lately she had begun to question whether she had mistaken calm for connection, or silence for safety. And every time she tried to dismiss these thoughts, they returned stronger, heavier, refusing to be ignored. And then there was Celine, whose presence had always been a kind of emotional compass for Mira. The older sister who carried wisdom with a softness that didn't feel lecturing. The one person Mira trusted enough to expose her fears to. Yet even Celine had noticed the tension Mira tried to hide, gently asking questions that Mira wasn't brave enough to answer honestly. Questions like, when was the last time you felt seen? Or are you sure you're lonely because of life and not because of him? And though the words weren't accusations, they pressed against Mira's heart in a way that made her wonder whether she had spent too many years pretending everything was fine simply because she didn't know what else to do. The truth was that Mira had reached a point where the quietness of her days felt less like peace and more like an echo, where she moved around the house like a shadow of the woman she used to be. The version of herself who once had passions too bright to dim and dreams too loud to silence. And she kept asking herself when exactly she had traded those things for predictability. When she had agreed to shrink so that their life together could fit the mold Rowan found comfortable. It wasn't anger she felt toward him. Anger would have been easier, cleaner. Something she could wrap into a decision, but instead she felt a deep and restless ache. A yearning for something she couldn't name. Something that flickered just out of reach, like light reflected on water. That night when Rowan came home later than usual, smelling faintly of rain and exhaustion, he paused at the doorway in that quiet way he always had, as though seeking permission to enter his own home, and Mira, watching him over her shoulder, felt a rush of memories, early mornings with shared coffee, road trips filled with badly sung songs. Nights spent talking about nothing at all, and she wondered how those two people had become these two, strangers standing on opposite sides of the same kitchen. He asked her if she was okay, the question soft, almost gentle, but something in his voice sounded rehearsed, like concern spoken from habit rather than feeling. And Myra answered yes because no felt too complicated, too heavy, too close to the truth. She wasn't ready to speak aloud. Rowan reached for a glass, and the clink against the counter seemed to echo in the room, carrying a tension neither of them addressed. And Mira felt an urge to break the silence, to say something real, something honest, but the words caught in her throat, tangled with fear and doubt, resisting the light. Later, when she finally went upstairs, she found Celine sitting on the edge of the guest bed with a book she clearly wasn't reading. Her expression calm, but her eyes sharp in that way only someone who knows you deeply can manage. And Mira felt her sister studying her, waiting, sensing that Myra's silence held more weight than anything she might confess. Celine didn't push. Instead, she simply said, "You look like someone who's been holding her breath for too long." And that single sentence struck Mira harder than any confrontation, because she realized then that maybe she had been holding her breath not for a moment, not for a week, but for years, waiting for something to change without ever daring to reach for the change herself. They talked for a while, their voices low, drifting between memory and uncertainty. And Mira felt a strange mix of comfort and dread, because speaking her confusion out loud made it more real. less deniable, and she wasn't sure whether she was ready for the consequences that honesty might bring. As the night deepened and the house settled into its usual quiet, Mira finally slipped into her room where Rowan was already asleep. His breathing even, his face softened in the half-light. And she stood there for a long moment watching him, torn between love and loss, between habit and hunger for something unnamed, wondering whether a marriage could be both familiar and foreign at the same time. She lay down beside him, her mind restless, and she felt the distance between their bodies like an invisible river, flowing silently through the dark. And just when she finally closed her eyes, thinking the night would pass quietly, as always, she heard Rowan whisper something barely audible, almost dreamlike canned. The words made her eyes snap open, her breath catch, because what he murmured wasn't her name. It was Celine's and Mira's entire world tilted in a way she could no longer ignore.